Hi, and welcome to Manned Up Conversations, where we connect with evolving men to discuss issues around masculinity and manhood, and also provide tools to help us be better for our society.
If we sum it up in three broad categories, men tend to either withdraw, they tend to escapism, substance use, that kind of thing, or externalization, which is then kind of that, you talked about the slap or something like that. That's kind of when the emotion takes over, and it's a way of not dealing with, really, we're not engaging with that emotion on the inside. So I think what happens over time when we chronically disengage from our emotions is that then we actually become disconnected from them, and then we lack the awareness and the attunement to ourselves to actually know what each emotion feels like. So being able to have the words, being able to be curious about the feeling without judgment.
And welcome to Manned Up Conversations, man. This is another exciting episode as usual. Today I'm joined by a brother that I've met, man, and I'm always excited. Well, I shouldn't say always, because I think you're the second person that I'm getting from Pretoria. So Matthew Steele is here with us today, man. Matthew's, let me let you actually introduce yourself. Matthew, welcome to Manned Up, brother.
Thanks, man. Also excited to be here, and nice to know that I'm not the only person from Pretoria that's made his way onto your show.
We hosted a beautiful space for Pretoria Psychologist where we were speaking on the emotional world of men. But I know that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit into the conversation. But how did you get into this world of psychology?
Sure, that's I suppose a bit of a long story. I'll try and summarize it to keep it fairly short. But I was on a journey into mental health, and then while I was doing that studies, I realized that it was a bad fit for me. I was then struggling with some of my own mental health issues and realized that I needed to shift tact and shift gear. So then I changed from medicine over into psychology. And then from there, it really felt like I was coming home, like this was the right space for me. It was a much better fit. The work I found incredibly fascinating and really drove me to want to continue down that path. A little bit of history from my side is my mother's a clinical psychologist as well, so I think there was that early on exposure into this mental health side of the world, which then kind of set the pathway forward. So I kind of knew what the life looked like and knew what I'd be getting myself into, which was helpful, along the journey. And obviously having some of the emotional language, which was part and parcel of my upbringing, then being able to utilize those lessons that I learned in my home space, and then my journey into psychology. So that was basically some of how I got in. Was then actually going for it. It's not an easy thing to get into, especially the further on you get in, kind of the lower your chances get to make it all the way to the end, because the classes get smaller and smaller. I mean, I had my master's group, there were 10 of us in the class in total, and they're probably out of 500 or so applicants that apply for the position. But the classrooms are so small because the training is so intense. It's basically like a 2-to-1 ratio of lecturers then to students because of the intensity of the training that needs to take place. So yeah, but managed to get in happily so, and here I am. Yeah,
I love it, man. And you mentioned that your mother you said she was a clinical psychologist.
Yes.
Okay, and always whenever I hear someone bring up parents, is we bring up one or the other, right? Whoever the hero is, I suppose, or the one that we took from. But did you grow up with your father as well?
Yes. So I suppose also. Interesting story. My parents divorced when we were quite young. I think they separated from when I was about 7, and they got divorced when I was about 10. There was a little bit of an extended process of separation there that happened before the final divorce, and then my dad, kind of moved out, and he's a professor in microbiology himself, so also kind of in the medical field. But he, went to work for the World Health Organization in Switzerland. So from when I was about 12 or 13, he left the country. And then he's now subsequently moved to Seattle in the States, where he works for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that side. So as much as he was, I suppose, around in some ways, in more kind of practical ways, he wasn't around. Although we still maintained a relationship, and I think a good relationship. Obviously, we had our issues and some of that stuff from your dad not being there all the time. But I think that's also part of growing up, is in being able to understand and recognize your parents for who they are and how they are, and what kind of drove some of the decisions that they had to make. I'm not saying it's an easy process to go through, but that was part of my story. My mom always worked hard in her field and managed to provide in the ways that she could, and as my dad did in his ways, which were different ways of in some ways trying to do the same thing.
Sure, man. I love that story, man, because often when we tell those stories of, the father left, you often villainize that man, right? Or you villainize whichever parent who wasn't around. But having that maturity to kind of say that, it happened, and I kind of see it for what it is, without putting too much blame on either one of them. I often say here that I met my dad when I was 21. I didn't really want to meet him, but then having to get to, talking to him and kind of hearing his stories, but also hearing from other people that who knew him, it's kind of like, okay, that humanizes him a little bit, Then I can kind of hear, okay, he had challenges of his own, so I can understand that. But now we're gonna go into our conversation, man. And one of the things that when I think about men and emotions, the thing that I saw, I think probably in the past 2 weeks, there's a campaign running on social media where an organization called Father Nation, run by Craig Wilkinson. We've actually had him here on the podcast, where he's encouraging men to cry, So they're talking about, man, when was the last time you cried and stuff like that. I'm like, okay, that's quite impressive. I like that. But for myself, growing up, crying for me was never a thing. And I've never had anyone being like, stop crying. You're a man, men don't cry. But we use that kind of analogy so much that, we don't cry because of that. But having studied and read some things, I found that, there's this thing called testosterone in us as men. And this testosterone has an impact on how, our emotions show up. When we spoke in the last session that we had, you brought up some points there that, I'd want you to share. I think from a clinical perspective, it would land a little bit easier, I guess, for some people. But there is an impact there, As you say, the women have estrogen, and that has its own impact. So talk us through that, man. How does testosterone kind of impact us as men?
So I think, first it's important to kind of understand a little bit about the role testosterone plays in the body, and it's got both a structural function and as well as a functional side to it. So it kind of falls into what we call the psychoactive side of things. It's produced by the brain, for the brain, as well as produced in some other areas in the body, and it helps with physical development, but it also helps with mental development.
Sure.
And I think the mistake that we can make here is undermining or underplaying the kind of functional effect that testosterone has in the normal brain and normal levels of testosterone. And it allows there's cascading effects and indirect effects that testosterone has on the brain. So, for example, it allows for healthy neurotransmitter function, healthy neurotransmitters in the brain, healthy messaging, communication in the brain as well. As well as then having, like I said, some of the physical side effects, increasing bone density, that kind of thing, muscle growth and whatnot. That's obviously, when we talk about steroid use, that's what we're talking about is often like testosterone that's been injected into the body. And I think what's important here is that there's a balance that testosterone needs to play, particularly on the male side of things, and allowing for healthy brain function and also then healthy emotional function. So that's maybe just as a precursor to some of the other parts of the discussion, that I think you want us to get to. Yeah. Part of what happens with boys and girls when they're born, there's a difference. The boy's body and the boy's brain is somewhat, or to simplify the terms, is somewhat flooded with a testosterone surge, and that has effects on the brain in terms of the connections between the two hemispheres. And my understanding is that, for lack of a better term, parts of it is almost dissolved with the testosterone flood, which leads to a reduced amount of communication or connection between the two hemispheres when compared to females' brains. Now, this is not saying that men don't have emotional capacity or don't have functional brains in the same way women do. It's just speaking to the differences in function between those two.
Yeah.
And then that has some indirect effects down the line for men and boys later. And I think part of the important message here is that men and boys kind of respond and react and feel their emotions in a slightly different way to how women experience them. So that's I think the important message here. Part of what we see, and I think there's a lot of discussion kind of around testosterone replacement therapy for men with low testosterone, and I think often the problem for men is having an incorrect balance of the testosterone. So when the testosterone is low, what does that mean and what does that look like?
Okay.
And part of what we see with low testosterone is it almost looks like a depression. So we see things like low libido, fatigue, lower energy levels, kind of reduced drive in some sense, as well as then sadness or irritability, and this then all looks like a depression, and we even see things like erectile dysfunction, So then once again, kind of getting boys and men to the right levels of testosterone for their age group becomes really important in terms of their own mental health and their own ways of them dealing with the challenges that they may face. And I think there's a stigma attached to that as well.
Yeah.
As a man or a boy being told that, or an adolescent being told that you've got low testosterone, it almost feels emasculating in some sense.
You're not a man.
Well, exactly.
Sure.
Which obviously is not the case, but it speaks to some of the challenges that are being faced by men in this. And also then the self-confidence that takes a knock, with that, and how that then also leads to these other knockdown effects after the fact.
I'm laughing because we had a conversation about erectile dysfunction with one of my mates, where someone was, I think they married, and their partner has been complaining to one of the friends that, man, this guy is so aggro in the house. What's going on with him? And then one of the friends went and spoke to the guy, and he said, hey, man, listen, I haven't been able to get it up for, 2 years or whatever. And he's so angry at that, and it just reminds you that we get so riled up, and it's like, man, why aren't things functioning? But we don't go to get it checked out. We don't even speak about it, Back to that point of you saying we feel emasculated when things don't kind of function in the way that we expect them to.
Yeah, and I think there's a huge amount of shame that then gets associated with that, and shame is one of those funny emotions that makes us want to hide.
Yeah.
And makes us want to hide that stuff that we're ashamed about from ourselves even. And very often with men, what we see is there's this kind of, what's the right word? Escape to irritability and anger that gets layered on top on the outside, when actually on the inside we're feeling something different, which would be sadness or fear or shame or guilt or something like that. And those kinds of emotions tend to make us feel quite vulnerable, tend to make us feel quite weak, tend to make us feel quite powerless. And it's the anger, the irritability, the frustration, the rage that then actually makes you feel powerful, and you wear it then as a shield. And a slight difference in between, and obviously we're talking in general terms here, but men tend to externalize their symptoms and women tend to internalize it. And that, I think that speaks volumes to kind of how things show up and how mental health issues tend to show up for men and for women. And that's often where that aggression comes from on the male side of things, and kind of then wanting to break things or wanting to blame someone else or get angry or direct your anger and your emotion at something, which then makes you feel like you're doing something about it when actually you're not addressing the underlying problem.
Here. Oh, man. Well, I mean, hey, we in South Africa are probably one of the most violent countries, right? Well, you can clearly see where that's kind of stemming from. Do you think we're kind of diagnosing some of these issues correctly, though, in terms of the advocacy and stuff that we're talking about?
Well, I think, that's a tricky question. I think under the right circumstances with the right professional, then the diagnosis can be made in the correct way. I think the mistake that a lot of people are making at the moment is kind of the self-diagnosis.
Sure.
And now, it's both a blessing and a curse having all this mental health knowledge kind of out in the open and on all these different social media platforms and all this information about what this looks like and what a narcissist does and what this, But I think what the curse here is that then people read into this more than they can or more than they're equipped to, and don't actually understand what these terms mean and what these terms look like and what these diagnoses mean and what they look like. And I think there's a lot of people who come into therapy saying like, oh, I think I've got ADHD, or I think I've got autism, or my partner's a narcissist or something like that. And when we start to unpack some of those things, we see that that's not actually what's going on. There's something else happening here. And I really would encourage people and the listeners to this podcast to, if they are concerned about a mental health issue that they might be faced with, then go and seek help and go and get the appropriate, go to the appropriate places to get the right diagnosis for you, if there's even a diagnosis. I think that's the other fallacy that people fall into is I have to have big problems to go and see a psychologist, to go see a counselor, to go see a psychiatrist or something like that, when that's not really the case. You can go there just because you're faced with challenges in your life. You can go there because you're feeling stuck in your life. And that's a good enough reason to go and seek help without there needing to be this huge, big diagnosis and problem that you're faced with. And I think that's also an important message for people to hear. It's okay to not be okay. And it's okay to go to see someone just for mental health reasons and not necessarily for mental illness. So there is that side of things here too.
I love that. Man, that's so incredibly well put. You mentioned a bit earlier about your parents playing a role in terms of your understanding of, some of the emotional world, right? You were a bit more expressive, I guess, than, I don't want to say than most guys, but on average, we could say that, okay, you had a bit more language, you had a bit more colorful language than most. So what part do you think sort of our parents play in terms of helping us, kind of relate with the world emotionally and that type of thing?
Well, I think it's a very, very important question in this. And I think this is also where some of the anger and rage and violence comes from in terms of the South African context. We've got a huge problem with absent fathers. And that has a massive impact on the development of a child. And the role that our parents essentially play is we talk about the masculine and the feminine side, the paternal and the maternal side of things. And what they represent ultimately is our first engagement with important relationships. So our relationship to our parents in many ways becomes our relationship to other people and our relationship to the world and ourselves. It kind of creates the blueprint for how we relate and see the world, and what lens we see the world through. And this is, what we call attachment. And I'm simplifying things here, but I think the role that they play ultimately impacts almost everything from there on. And whether it's just your mom at home or just your dad at home, that's going to have an impact on the way that you see yourself, and then relate to the other sex or relate to the same sex, depending on how that plays out. And I think that's also where there's this sense of anger and violence that comes through, is not always having the right role models in place to help you navigate these intense emotions. Because boys and girls are both emotional. This is not a case of women are more emotional and men are less emotional. It's about having the tools and the experience and the relationship to those emotions, which becomes important, becomes kind of the crux of the conversation. I think.
Man, I love this. And we spoke about emotions. I think I was on 702 on an interview or something, that most times where you get men showing a lot of emotion is in relationships, right? But for some reason, when we just bantering with each other, there's the emotion is there, but it's very much unseen, right, or unspoken, until you get in a relationship, and now you're forced to deal with very heavy emotions, because then you're in love there, you are hurt there. Things that with a bunch of guys, like, I'm hurt, but I can hide that, like you say, I can mask that and push the guy or slap him or whatever. They don't really know that I'm hurt. They just think, he's just, wailing out because he's angry or whatever. But then with your lady, you can't necessarily start slapping, because then that requires a whole different kind of communication, right? So how do you think we can sort of work our way to sort of understanding each other's sort of, do we call it emotional language? I don't want to call it love language. As you said, it's a very pop culture kind of expression. So yeah, what's our emotional language? How do you develop that in relationships, you know?
Well, I think the first step, in kind of developing that emotional language is getting used to some of the words that are involved in this. And actually, you know, something that I use in my therapy is what we call a feelings wheel. And it's literally like a list of emotions that are there, so that then you've got the language, you've got the words to start to describe the feeling. And that is almost the first step. Well, I suppose the first step in some ways is trying to tune in to the feeling and get used to feeling something. Because very often, you know, men tend towards things like, you know, if we sum it up in three broad categories, men tend to either withdraw, they tend to escapism, substance use, that kind of thing, or externalization, which is then kind of that, you know, you talked about the slap or something like that. That's kind of when the emotion takes over, and it's a way of not dealing with we're not engaging with that emotion on the inside. So I think what happens over time when we chronically disengage from our emotions is that then we actually become disconnected from them, and then we lack the awareness and the attunement to ourselves to actually know what each emotion feels like.
Yeah.
So being able to have the words, being able to be curious about the feeling without judgment. You know, the other thing that I see is a lot of people make emotions a moral thing. I should not be feeling this. It's wrong for me to feel this. You know, why am I feeling this way? Particularly about those unpleasant emotions, you know, whether it's anger or sadness or irritation or frustration or something like that. But actually take away that moral language and say, okay, well, I am feeling this. So what does that actually feel like? Where do I feel this in my body? What is it that I feel the urge to do to get rid of this feeling, as opposed to just sitting with it and kind of experiencing it? And that, I think that in many ways helps men actually get in tune again with their bodies and with what they're feeling.
Sure. I mean, we've had a comment saying, like, I think we were talking about Jordan Sancho, who used to play for Man United. I think there was something where he was like, he's going through some mental health issues and he did a bit of time off. But people are saying that, okay, so this guy is basically saying that he wants to go off in the woods with a bunch of men and talk about feelings, you know? And I kind of like, I laughed at it, but then sometimes I understand that maybe some people are not there yet, right? That for some people it seems very foreign for men to go and do something like that. So when you hear stuff like that, then do you think the world is ready, though, for, as much as we encourage men to kind of open up and connect with each other and that, are we really ready for men to come out and open up in that way? I mean, look at Will Smith, for example, you know? We talk about, cry, man, do what you do. But he's become a meme. Tyrese has become a meme. Almost everyone that comes out publicly, and I emphasize publicly so much because, I know a lot of us do cry in private, you know. I think it's a fallacy to say that men don't cry. I could argue that plenty of us have cried in the shower or in bed or whatever. Our partner probably knows that we've cried more times than we've actually shown in public. But there's just this thing of men being out there, outwardly emotional or vulnerable. There's just like, we're not used to that, man. Do you think we'll ever is it going to take time for us to get there? Are we there as a culture, as a society?
Well, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think really well put as well. I think it speaks to kind of this discrepancy between the expectations of men, you know, that are kind of, there's a dichotomy there. You've got to be a man, but also now be emotional. But then we're not given the tools to be emotional and to show that in constructive ways. And then even when attempting to do that, then it's like, okay, well, now he's a simp or something like that. Or he's a, you know, I think the word they use for Will Smith is a cuckold. Or you know.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And I think then that also then disempowers the movement that we're intending to make. And look, I think that in general, we're moving towards that kind of thing and being more accepting. There obviously are going to be caveats to that and challenges that are faced along the way. But I think men are getting better at having some of these conversations. I mean, this podcast is a perfect example of that.
Yes,
the fact that it's two men sitting across from each other, having this conversation about emotions and about the importance of emotions, particularly in the man's world, for men, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I think that is already telling us a lot. Exactly. This wouldn't have happened 5, 10, 15, 20. And 30 years ago, no ways, but look at how far we've come now. And I think there's still a journey to go.
Exactly.
And I think part of that, what becomes important is the world being more receptive to this kind of thing happening, so that then it doesn't feel like almost going too fast, too quickly. Like, are we even there yet ready to do that? I think the only way to figure that out is to then do it. You're not going to be able to predict that beforehand.
And it's not going to be, I think there's something I always say that, I look at the manosphere, there's a lot being said about it. But as much as it's negative and it's got things there that we don't want to hear, there's a lot of expression in there, right? It's very emotional. It's a very emotional space because you can see these men are frustrated, right? These men they want something different. They want something new. Yeah, their language might be very offensive to some people, but that's exactly what we need to get out of our system. And then maybe the guys will come afterwards kind of see, okay, well, that language didn't really work for us, right? We've kind of used that language now. Then let's move on to other things, right? I think that the manosphere kind of conversations, this guy banter pretty much going online. It's never going to change. It's never going to stop. It's always going to be there. But at least now, by us having it out, then ladies are also starting to see that, okay, I don't really want to hear that from men, but maybe I need to check myself, about some of the things that they're saying. Or maybe, oh, wow, I saw that in my friend. Okay, there might be some truth to that, I think the shutting down of some of these conversations sometimes because of the energy that comes with it sometimes comes at a cost to us, right? You might have to speak to people you don't agree with sometimes. You might have to engage with people you don't agree with, and that's probably where you're going to learn the most, more than when you're talking to someone that you're very agreeable on literally everything with, So it's just similar to having this conversation now. I was just thinking when you're saying it, you're a white man, I'm a black guy, That's also showing that, okay, a black man, maybe we express ourselves in this way. For white guys, it's like this. Maybe someone would be like, man, I never looked at things like that, So it's literally us having these, as you're saying, that I think pours into someone else. So I hope that you listening to this, that made sense for you in some kind of way. And I always encourage that, listen to the stuff by yourself. You can have it with your guys and whatever and banter about it, but listen to it, as you say, sit with it for a little bit. What does it mean to me? And then you can take it to other people instead of just reacting for the sake of, I don't like that. Maybe that's a kind of a deflection at times. And no, I don't really want to go into that just now.
No, and I agree completely with you. I think that sometimes the way that men end up communicating about this can be unhelpful, and can be somewhat destructive as well. And I suppose it's important that we also, as men, hold men accountable to the way that this is spoken about and shared specifically in some of those more public spaces. When you're one-on-one with your best friend, do the venting that you need to do. It's a safer space to use that language. But I think we also need to challenge men to speak to their underlying fears, and not just their overlying complaints about things, because that's going to show that there's an emotional development, emotional growth, and insight into what actually is going on, and allowing men to share their fears without them judging that and being receptive, and allowing us to, as a society, to be receptive to that. I think a lot of what's happened is this kind of comparison between men's issues and women's issues. And if we're talking about men's issues and we're not focusing enough on women's issues, and we're talking about women's issues, we're not focusing enough on men's issues. And I think it gets too confusing and conflated there. Just because men have got issues doesn't mean that women don't. Just because women have got issues doesn't mean that men don't. And you've got to find space to have both conversations without it detracting from the other one.
Exactly.
Some of these issues are interrelated. And some of them are separate, and that's okay. And we've got to have space for both and allow the conversation to be for both, and then holding each group accountable for what's going on there.
Yes. Oh, man. I'm enjoying this, man. Are you enjoying this? Come on, man. So you're speaking on this now, and when you walked in here a little bit earlier, I was telling you about a hike that we're going to be hosting, and you mentioned something specific about the setting that you do your therapy in. And in most cases, I think I was watching someone on YouTube, I forgot his name, I think it's Paul Elam. He's also one of the very much in the red pill community. And I watch him for the sake of, I don't agree with most of what he says, but then I'm like, this guy's very interesting for him to be so brave to even say this stuff. But he uses a lot of satire as well. So I kind of get that he's trying to appeal to people's sort of lighter, more emotional side, or I guess, lighter emotions, but also speaking about very much important topics. And he speaks about, this traditional, he has a couch, he has like some tissue right there, just in case you're going to cry. That sometimes for guys, it's like, I don't know if I want to go into that space, man, because those things kind of bring out tears already, or they kind of force you to kind of like, okay, these people expect me to like open up. That forces you to close off in a way, right? So you spoke about, taking now a walk, for example, to kind of have a conversation, maybe for couples. For what other settings do you think we can use to kind of have more conversations, have guys engage with the stuff a little bit more?
Well, I think, we've got to also understand the way that men and women bond differently and connect to each other differently. It was something we spoke a little bit about in our previous facilitation, that podcast we did earlier. But to use generalities here, women bond face to face, which it speaks to that ability to kind of communicate, with their words, where men bond shoulder to shoulder. And that speaks to the kind of the doing and the action. And I think therapy in many ways has become quite a feminized space, and you kind of often the expectation then on men in therapy is to engage with this as a woman would engage, which is just to spill their guts and to have the tears and all of those things that come. And what we see is that it's not really how men want to do it. And that doesn't make it right or wrong. But then being able to think laterally, think broadly about how we try and create space for the conversation is really important, and I think doing something as simple as going for a walk with your patient, in a setting like this, for example, really helps create a different kind of conversation and create movement in the therapeutic process that you might otherwise feel stuck in for a little bit longer, just sitting face to face, trying to talk. And something that you see with men, it's actually rare that men will be facing each other in the way that we're facing each other right now, kind of squared up against each other. Because this is can be somewhat threatening in some ways. And often if you look at a group of men, they'll be standing slightly off shoulder. So they might be facing in the same direction, but they're not standing facing each other like this. The only time men tend to square up, and obviously generalities here again, but when they square up, then there's going to be a physical fight or altercation or something
it's like now we're sizing each other up. Like,
well, exactly. And obviously it helps. We've got a table in between us. I suppose this is also a setting that men in some ways are used to kind of having a drink, we're drinking water, but there's something that allows for the conversation to happen in this. So even just changing up the space a little bit allows for men to engage differently, and not forcing them to focus on the uncomfortable things. Yes, you want to challenge them, you want to take them to some of those deeper places, but allowing them to take the conversation where they also want it to go, which tends to be more focused on the problems they face now and the problems that they anticipate in the future. So they're looking for more solutions as opposed to now just talking about what's happened before, and something that they can't change.
And I wanna just jump in on that, because we often speak about trauma quite a lot, right? Inner child healing and doing shadow work, and all of that stuff involves a lot of past stuff. So how do we then kind of work with that with men? Because then you're forced to go backwards. So I'm like, I want to deal with today, and where am I, like you say, where am I going? Right? But now, does it mean we miss out on things by kind of refusing? Well, it's not refusing, but not wanting to kind of work on those things, right? Does that now, I guess, limit the kind of healing that we get to experience?
Well, I think we, let's just contextualize this a little bit. I think part of when you do a history and you find out what some of the things that the men have been through now.
Sure.
The thing is, they don't want to stay stuck talking about that same thing and that event as it happened back then, but helping them see how that event impacts them now allows for that healing and growth that you're talking about. And look, this is the same for women as well. You also want to show them how that stuff impacted them in the now, and helping them bring about that insight into what's happened and how that changes things for me now and potentially impacts my future becomes part of the conversation so that the healing can happen.
Yes, sir.
And that still allows for it. So we're not missing out on something here. As much as in maybe utilizing in a slightly different way.
Man. And you mentioned the quote. I'm trying to remember that, but I'm going to paraphrase here. But you said something about a man's hands is his worst. Did you say his worst enemy? Or
the biggest threat to a man's life is his own hands.
There we go, man. I kept that, and I think I posted it on my WhatsApp as soon as you said it. And I wanted to bring that here and kind of explain that for us. What does that kind of mean for you?
Well, I think it speaks to, well, look, I think that in many ways men have been in crisis for a number of years now, and this is obviously, we're speaking about suicide here, and so women tend to attempt suicide 3 times more than men do. Men get it right, so to speak. The men actually commit suicide 3 times more than women. And I think it speaks to the violent nature with which men tend to engage with these kinds of things. If they're going to kill themselves, they shoot themselves in the head, they hang themselves, they cut their throats or something like that. Whereas women tend to use less violent means to attempt suicide. I think, look, I'm not trying to undermine the troubles that women go through in their number of attempts, which is obviously scary in many ways. But the point here really is that of all the different variables, all the different things that could kill someone, for a man, the biggest threat is his own hands. The biggest threat in some ways is suicide. And that speaks to the crisis that men are facing right now. And that feeling of them being isolated and alone. One of the last stage of depression is suicide.
Wow.
That's the trajectory. And men tend to, like I mentioned earlier, they tend to withdraw in those moments. And there's that deep sense of shame, like, I'm not coping, I'm not doing it. And that means there's something wrong with me. And yes, there's, people want to talk about chemical imbalances in the brain with depression and how these thoughts are, you're not thinking clearly at that time, which is true. But I think it's the means by which men tend to attempt suicide. And it's often that you get surprised by who it was who did it, because, and I think often it's related to that sense of shame and that sense of being isolated and having to do it and figure it out on your own. And when you don't know what the answer is, when you don't feel like there's options, when you feel powerless to change anything, that's when suicide becomes a risk. That's when the suicide comes up as an option, as a way of getting away from these problems. So I hope that answers your question.
Definitely. No, I mean, I'm listening to what you're saying, and thank God for the work of Parker Palmer as well. I've been kind of introduced to that in very light, subtle ways, right? And I ended up getting a hold of one of his books where he speaks about his bouts with depression and him seeing it as a different experience as opposed to just a sadness, but also a journey of going inwards, right? He said it's a journey of going inwards and downwards, because now all your resources, all the skills, your knowledge and expertise that you think, and coping mechanisms that you have are quite useless when you're depressed. And it forces you now to kind of see yourself as a human being who's actually experiences a full range of emotions, right? And sometimes it can kill you. Some people can't get out of that. But he spoke about sometimes he wished he could stay in that, because then now he feels more alive than he's ever felt, So it's quite interesting that for some people, depression is like this thing that changes their life completely. And for some people, it's like, man, I can't bear this thing. I just want to get out of it. So it's very, very interesting how you kind of laid it and how other people also see it. I think we often don't speak to depressed people enough. We speak about depression, but we've never actually spoken to someone and, what their experiences were and how they see it, as opposed to what the world of clinical psychology and that kind of says. Because there's so much nuance in that.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting, you say, like, as he went inwards and downwards in that depression as well. And it's almost like the things that would help you get out are the things that you actually end up struggling with, which is in your depression as well. So it becomes this vicious cycle and this almost self-fulfilling prophecy in some way to make it more difficult to get out the longer you stay in the hole, even though it kind of highlights then when you are out of it, then those positive feelings come back, and it's like, wow, the world is real. There's color in my world again. And I think I suppose the point I want to make here is really you can't pick and choose which emotions you feel. You need to experience the full range. Otherwise, it all becomes gray anyway.
I love it, right? So, now we got to talk about some strategies, man. So, of course, you spoke about the wheel of emotions. And I love that. I think I'm gonna steal that from you. But what else can we do as men, to kind of get in touch with that emotional side of ourselves? Yeah.
Well, I suppose an important part of it would be having the courage to be vulnerable, and having the courage to ask for help when you need it. I think that's an important part of it. I think a lot of people think of bravery or courage as I'm fearless. I don't feel fear.
Yeah.
I'm not afraid of what's going on. But I think that's exactly the opposite. Without fear, there is no courage. There is no bravery. And I think it's important to recognize fear as your opportunity for bravery. If you're just doing things without any fear, then how are you being brave? You're just actually acting normally, And I think that's the fallacy that people believe in this, and you've got to actually reframe what courage and bravery is. And in some ways, the bravest thing you can do is ask for help. Because there's a humility in that act as well.
Yes,
a reaching out for connection and saying, look, I don't have all the answers. I don't have it all sorted out. I'm not coping. I'm struggling. And that actually, there's something liberating in that. So once again, allowing men to be vulnerable and challenging men to be vulnerable as an act of courage, I think is a really useful strategy in terms of getting men to actually open up.
Sure.
Because they do have the feelings. And I'm sure you've sat with your friends, and maybe it's over a braai, or maybe it's over, when you're playing some sport or something together. And it's not that men aren't vulnerable with each other. It's men will choose some moments to be vulnerable.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think we've got to allow for those moments.
Oh man, that's
opportunities for them.
That's brilliant. And I'm gonna use that analogy again. I think it was from Parker Palmer, who says like the soul is like a wild animal, right? Is we don't go into big groups and start shouting and beating our chests, because then the soul hides there. There's very little vulnerability in there. But while we're sitting and just being quiet or talking about whatever, then suddenly someone says, "Hey, man, this is what's been going on," and it's like, "Oh, okay, wow," and just kind of like, okay, there's no answer, there's no response to that. It's like just an acknowledgement, a nod, maybe a little awkward silence, and okay. And what else,
Or jump into solution mode, which is, okay, well, this is what you must do about it.
Well, I mean, us as doers, that's what we want to do, right? But as you say, like in most cases, that kind of vulnerability just comes out, and it's like, oh, that hit us when we least expected. So then you can't really jump into fixing, because then you're not looking to fix it. You're also like, geez, I don't know, that guy is dealing with that. Then I think that in that way, we kind of let guys kind of just say it, man. Like, oh wow, then maybe I'll call you in a week. That, man, you said something the other day there. I'm probably going through it myself. And then that's the beauty of, I guess, sharing stories and having conversations, right? Not being so much in I guess, fixed on this is where we want to go with it. And for sometimes men, we have that problem of, okay, what's the end goal? What's the end result of coming to have a conversation with you? Why are we going to this trip? Sometimes kind of like, guys, just have conversations. Just sit there, Yeah, watch the game. Maybe that's what we need to do. Our friend is feeling very depressed. Let's go to the game, and whatever this guy wants to do, that's what we're going to do. I think that honors the person. It kind of humanizes them, as you say, and allows them to kind of share whatever they want to share. Maybe they don't want to talk about that thing. They want to talk about something else. We're not going to beat it out of him. Just let the person be, And at times that might seem a bit heartless. That why aren't you guys talking to your friends about something? I was talking to my friend as well on the way here, and I said, listen, man, we want to help our friend. We want to be there for him. But what we can do is call him. This is what we're doing. You want to come? Come through. Let's do it, right? If you come, you enjoy it. That's it. If you want to share whatever you want to share it. But we're not going to tell you that. Like, we just create the space. and then if anything comes out of that, then we're happy. If nothing comes out of it, we're happy either way. It's not about fixing. Like my brother and Sam always says, don't go into a conversation with someone trying to fix, because you actually, as you also said it before, is you actually dishonoring or disempowering them. You're not letting the inner wisdom kind of show up, and which is something that I've also been exploring with quite recently, is we all have this inner wisdom, man. But do you think that, I suppose, being neglectful of things like that, right, the inner workings of myself, or not being vulnerable, do you think people actually make it out and kind of just live their life without having to tap into that type of energy?
Well, I think that is tapping into that energy. I think part of what you're trying to do in therapy in some way is activate those inner resources.
Okay.
And that's the empowerment that we're speaking about. And I think, similarly to fear being the opportunity for courage, struggle is your opportunity for resilience. So it's going through the struggle and knowing that you can get through the struggle that shows you that you are stronger and capable, and you've got this, and you can actually make something out of the darkness. And I think it's almost a failure of those inner resources in some sense, and maybe that's a strong word, but where people then don't get out of those things. It's almost then an identification with the problem as opposed to with the ways out of this. And sometimes when we really got stuck in a problem, then all we can see is the problem.
Sure. And
that's when the conversation becomes useful, because it can give you perspective on things that is different from the way that you're currently seeing them. So yeah, I mean, I think that's my thoughts on that.
That's excellent, right? Proper. Okay. Well, I mean, we all almost at the end point of this, man. But I've got a question that I usually ask, and I never really put that out to people in talking points and that. But based on things that you've been doing and interactions that you've been having with men, and women. But what do you think we can do for guys? What each man can do for himself, to kind of honor himself, whether it's emotionally, physically, spiritually, whatever it is, that can sort of contribute to the betterment of himself, like I said, but also to the betterment of the people around him and society. Because like we say, right, if we get the men in our societies to kind of get well, then I think our societies will be much better. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose it's a complicated question in essence, but I think we've got to help people focus on what they can handle first, and if that's doing things firstly just for themselves, and then getting grips with that. And this is kind of the journey into adulthood, right?
Sure.
As you become an adult, then you're needing to take more ownership and responsibility for your life, and then finding the ways to do that. And once you've got a handle on that, then being able to start building a relationship, and then being able to also assist and support in that system. Now, once again, men and women are responsible for their own lives, but we can start to build our realm of influence, let's say, and realm of support as we get older, and as we get better grips on each various stage or subsystem that we're speaking to. So whether that's starting with yourself, moving into a relationship, moving into a family, moving into looking after your neighbors, and then looking at bigger and bigger ways that you can start to take responsibility and help in ways that you can, but I think it's also there's no shortcut through this. So I think it's a complicated question, because we can obviously talk about some of the ways that people can honor themselves and exercise and diet and friends and hobbies and work life and family life, and I think we all kind of know those things intuitively in some ways. Getting enough water is another thing you can do, but I think we've got to think about this in terms of how much load can I actually carry, and what you'll find is that the bigger the load that you take on, the stronger you get as well. It's the same as exercise in that way, and you don't start with the 100 kilograms and try to bench press that. You start at where you're at,
yes, sir.
And then you progress from there.
Oh man.
So I think that's really important in this, is because I think there's also this fallacy that I've got to now do it all and do everything all at once. When you're allowed to take a step-by-step process, you're allowed to grow and evolve as you are evolving and maturing in your life.
Man, that's quite spot on. I love it, man. So Matthew, man, tell us, where do people find you? How can people reach you? If someone's listening to this and they need help, we're going to put all of that in the show notes, but just for reach for people who are listening.
So I've got my practice is here in Pretoria. It's in Linwood Glen, so close to, like, in between Menlyn and Linwood and Atterbury Road, and it's close to Varsity College and St Albans College on that side. So that's where I'm physically based. And then I've got my email address, so you can contact my practice if you're looking for help, and that's just practice@msdsteele.com. And then there's a WhatsApp number that you can also contact me on in relation to my practice. I've got my personal number, but I keep that separate from the practice stuff.
No, we don't want people to come there, man. Maybe some groupies are listening here. We're going to get you in trouble, man.
And then I've got a website that I'm building at the moment, but as soon as that's up and running, then I'll let you know, so that can also be posted onto the site.
All right, cool, man. No, appreciate it, man. Matthew Steele is here, man. It's another wonderful conversation about the emotional world of men. I think this might be the first one that we kind of fully dedicate to just speaking around emotions. So I really hope that you guys got some juice from that. I hope that you got some, I don't want to call it motivation or inspiration, but just something to think about, something to talk about with your mate, something to talk to your lady about. I think this is one to actually listen to your lady with, It's maybe the things that you guys are struggling with in your relationship that you could maybe pick from. I don't think it's only for men who have problems. I think women could also have some issues that we spoke about here. Maybe you're too much in your masculine. We don't know, maybe you might need to ease off a little bit on that, But either way, man, I hope you really enjoyed the conversation. I am Kaugelo Habiani from Man Up Conversations. It's been truly inspiring and awesome. We'll catch you on the flip side, man. Peace and love.